Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar. We are going to get started in just a few minutes. We're just giving another minute or two to allow some more folks to connect. We'll begin here very shortly. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar so that we can take a closer look at what lies ahead for Trinidad and Tobago's economy. We have some folks still joining, so I'm going to get some logistics out of the way. I'd like to thank you all for being on the call. I can see that we have a lot of our Market Dynamics Caribbean subscribers with us here today, so thank you for joining us as well. Just to give some logistics, on the right side of your screen, you will see that there's a chat panel, and you can use that chat panel to submit questions for our question and answer session, which is going to be at the end of this call. So feel free to go ahead and submit those. You can, before you click submit, you can select to everybody if you want everyone to receive the question, or if you want it to be sent just to me, you can go ahead and select to admin. I'm your host today, and your moderator as well, Melissa Marchand, the Caribbean Strategy Advisor for Global News Matters. And joining us today, we have a client, a much admired friend of ours at GNM and top regional economist, Trinidad's own Marla Dukharan, joining us. Marla is the Royal Bank of Canada's group economist for Caribbean banking, and she joins us today live from Port of Spain. Good morning, Marla, and welcome back. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Melissa. Good morning, everyone on the call. Thank you so much for having me again, Melissa. It's always a pleasure.
I'm going to just go ahead and jump right into the content then. The Minister of Finance presented his mid-year review of the budget last week, and so we really want to give everyone on the call today is a better feel for what does this mean for business. So we and our clients have been very anxiously awaiting this mid-year review, and I'd like to start off by asking you, Marla, to just go ahead and give us some of the highlights from what the minister said, and what have been those reactions, those initial reactions in Trinidad?
Okay, well, reactions are always very varied. We've had people criticizing that the cuts that he made were too big, some saying that the cuts were too small. I think you can't be all things to all people ever. So, but we have to give the credit to the minister for making some very difficult decisions and some policy moves that are probably not the most popular. What stood out the most for me, of course, was the adjustment again to the fuel subsidy. There was always a lot of talk in the media, in the public domain, about the need to address the fuel subsidy, because a subsidy that really promotes an efficiency and also benefits the more wealthy, as opposed to benefiting those who are more in need, is a subsidy that is not well structured. And so the fact that he addressed that was quite something that we were looking forward to and we were happy to see. The minister, of course, reduced the budget from by about 4 billion to 59 billion TT dollars. Some have said 4 billion was not enough. Some have said 4 billion was too much. The thing about it is we have to remember that over 7 billion TT dollars was really it has to be devoted to monies that were incurred for last year's spending that were not honored in the previous year. So $5 billion for public sector wage settlements, a couple $1 billion for arrears to contractors. So of that 59 billion, even though some of us might say the 4 billion cut was insufficient. Maybe about 7 to 9 of that 59 billion was really devoted to expenditure that was incurred in the previous fiscal year. But because our fiscal budget is calculated on a cash basis and those arrears were racked up last year, they have to be paid out of this year's expenditures. So this year's expenditure is actually well below 59 in terms of what was incurred and accruing to this fiscal year. And I think that's important to remember. I think what was also very striking for me was the fact that the minister mentioned that we're going to have a contraction of about 2% this year, in addition to the contraction of about 2% last year, in addition to the contraction of about 1% in 2014. That was quite striking for me. You generally don't get the government giving you the straight figures so early. Sometimes, you tend to hear them be very cautious with good reason. Sometimes you don't want to cause alarm and destabilize things. But those were, to me, the most striking points coming out of the budget.
Okay, Marla, I'm getting some feedback here that some folks are having difficulty viewing the webinar. I'm just going to go ahead and pose the question, and I'm going to ask that people just answer us in the chat box, because I don't want to, continue until I'm sure that everyone's.
Sure, no problem.
Just give me a second here.
Of course.
Okay, it looks like, yeah, I'm getting feedback that people are seeing it. So if anyone's having any difficulty, I just want to invite them to please reload their link, and hopefully that'll take care of the problem. Marla, we're going to go on, and I'd like to just ask you, taking a closer look at the budget, what types of recurring expenditure lines do you expect to be cut?
Well, of course, the biggest line that in the government's spending right now is transfers and subsidies. We know that the minister addressed the issue of subsidies, the fuel subsidy. He increased fuel prices by 15% once in October and again in this mid-year review. So that line of transfers and subsidies is going to be reduced. In terms of wages and salaries, he mentioned some of the Make Work programs being restructured, which would be the URP and CPAP programs. We also know that he had mentioned in the original, before this mid-year review, he mentioned that there would be a 7% cut in spending from each ministry. Now, he did not mention that again in this current mid-year review. But I believe that there will be some cuts in transfers and subsidies coming out of the cuts and transfers to ministries. The other thing would be GATE. This is the tertiary education funding program. That again would come out of transfers and subsidies. So basically that would be the biggest line item I would look at, and then to a certain extent wages and salaries as well. At some point, maybe not in a meaningful way right now, but maybe a little bit later on, that would be addressed.
Okay, on the other side of the equation, could you give us some insights into what's dragging down the revenue estimates?
Right. Well, the minister mentioned that we had weaker than expected collection of taxes from the energy sector. And that's because the energy sector suffered softer prices than they had originally budgeted for. The original budget was based on a $45 per barrel average price for oil. And we know that prices were more or less around the $30 range. Also, production levels have fallen, and I think that's something that the minister did not cater for in the original budget. And he mentioned it in this mid-year review that it's hard to convince the producers to continue to produce more and more at these levels. So we've had production falling quite significantly. In my report here, let me just give you some statistics on how that has fallen. So this is according to the Ministry of Energy's latest production publication, that crude oil production stood at 72,190 barrels per day in January, and natural gas production at 3,810 million square cubic feet, sorry. And this is an 8.2% decline in crude oil production in January 2016 versus the average for 2015. So we're seeing that we still have some declines coming in production. So that's the first thing that caused revenues to decline. The second thing is we know that the economy contracted, or is estimated to have contracted by the central bank by 2.1% last year. That means VAT revenue came in softer, income tax, corporation tax revenues all came in softer. Now, the thing about it is we are looking at a further contraction in the economy this year, so we might continue to see some further softening in tax receipts from VAT and from corporation tax. But in addition to that, the minister did mention that we have a certain degree of non-compliance with taxation. So you have VAT leakage that is widely discussed, and that's something that the government is looking to tighten up in terms of their tax administration so that they can earn and collect the kind of revenue that they've budgeted for. And finally, we saw that the minister cut the capital the capital financing items, which are really below the line items, but he counted it as revenue in the mid-year and in the original budget. He had originally said somewhere around 13 billion is what they expect to gain from capital transactions, so IPOs, special dividends, and so on. They're now expecting to collect just over 8 billion. Now, the reason for that, I'm not quite sure. Maybe there are issues around the execution, how quickly he can execute on some of these capital transactions, these IPOs and special dividends and divestment. He did, for example, mention that Republic Bank will be disposed of in an orderly fashion in 2017, whereas in the original budget last year, it was something that was carded for this fiscal year. So there was some adjustment as to what those capital transactions will look like this fiscal year. And so that's one of the other major adjustments to revenue.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to move on to your expectations for the economy. The minister in his report said that he expects the economy will contract 2%. And where do you see GDP growth? What's your expectation for GDP growth for 2016?
Well, yeah, that was very interesting. He said 2% contraction this year. The central bank projected in their latest report 2.3% contraction this year. The IMF had said 1% in their most recent review. So we're pretty clear that everybody expects a contraction this year. My guess is that the authorities probably want to be a little moderate with their forecast for contraction. And so I would quite expect, based on what we're seeing with the continuation of low oil prices as well as production levels falling, which we didn't really anticipate at the beginning of the fiscal year, I would suggest that maybe the contraction would be a bit steeper than the authorities are currently projecting. And my guess as well, given that the minister is saying they're not going to balance the budget by 2018, they're now looking at 2019, 2020, the adjustment period is going to be dragged out for a bit longer. And so we might see a longer recovery than originally anticipated.
Okay. And what's driving the drop in oil and gas output? Could you comment on that a little bit? Give us some color around that.
The production. Well, the thing is, we are a mature oil and gas producer. And so once you have mature fields, you would tend to have naturally a decline in production and output over time. So that's organic. But in addition to that, now you layer on top of that the fact that we've had lower prices for oil and gas. And the minister said it in his mid-year review, it's hard to convince the producers that they need to produce more at these levels. So I think the price is definitely a factor. And finally, there has been a lot of discussion around the fiscal framework governing the energy sector and the incentives or disincentives to produce, the incentives or disincentives to invest and to explore. based on what the taxation framework currently looks like. And there has been discussion from the energy sector with the government around probably amending the taxation framework to probably make it make some better incentives to produce and to explore as well.
Okay. And what do you expect from the non-oil and gas sector?
Well, as you know, according to the central bank data, we've seen contraction in the non-oil sector as well. The non-oil sector relies very heavily on fiscal spending. And insofar as we have softer fiscal spending coming out of softer oil and gas revenue, then that has a trickle-down effect into the non-oil sector via the fiscal spending mechanism. But in addition to that, that's a real effect. There is a perception, there's a perceived effect when oil prices are low in this country. People spend less, people invest less. I hear anecdotally people say to me, I don't think that's happening. You see Trinidadians shopping and having a great time and partying and drinking and eating out a lot. So anecdotally, you may not always see it, but I am also hearing business people saying that they are feeling it in the slowdown. So I think people are consuming less. And so the non-energy sector is suffering. We've also seen in the construction sector, for example, a lot of layoffs, and that was reported in the central bank reports. So there are some sectors contracting or slowing down faster than others, and I think construction is one of them. The central bank report also mentioned the finance sector as well. So we're looking at pretty much a broad-based contraction in and manufacturing. Sorry, let me not forget manufacturing sector. So we're looking at a pretty broad-based non-energy contraction as well.
Okay, now I'd like to spend just a few minutes taking a look at foreign exchange. What would be your expectations for the foreign exchange market?
Well, the minister, I was quite surprised to see that he gave some forward guidance as to where the exchange rate is headed. He did say 7% depreciation compared to on the September 2015 level. That will take us to roughly, from my calculation, 6.82 TT dollars to $1 US. Now, he did not specifically give a time frame, but I'm guessing, given that in his mid-year review he was discussing this fiscal year, I'm guessing he meant that 7% depreciation will cover this fiscal year. So 6.82 is a goal for the end of September this year. We expect also reserves to decline. Reserves are currently over 9 billion, just about 11 months of import cover. The central bank put a projection that they're expecting to see reserves decline to about 8.5 billion US dollars, or 10 months of import cover at the end of this year. Depending on how the inflows go relative to the outflows, it could be less or it could be more. I still think to get to 10 months of import cover, 8.5 billion at the end of this year is very healthy. 10 months of import cover is very, very healthy, certainly the highest in this region. And so, I'm not worried about that. The question is around, the price and the availability. Those are always issues that are very hot topics for discussion.
Okay, and could you also talk to us a little bit about inflation? I mean, you mentioned that there was a reduction in the fuel subsidy, and I'm not sure how that's played out in prices. And if you could just give us some information on how you see that playing out in terms of prices and what your projections are for inflation this year.
Right. Well, inflation has ticked up a little bit to just over 3%. Now, we've had a roughly 32.23 cumulative increase in fuel prices since October of last year, when the initial budget was delivered. 15% then, on top of another 15% now. And there was some empirical research done by the Ministry of Energy a long time ago, where they basically said that they tried to measure what the impact on prices would be. And I've calculated using their model that given the 32% or so cumulative increase in fuel prices, that we're looking at probably a 17% increase in prices, which means 17% inflation on top of the existing inflation rate. So, we're looking at anywhere around 20% inflation according to this paper. However, I would say that in reality, and that's assuming everything else remains the same and assuming that it's a linear relationship between the change in price in fuel and the change in price in inflation. Now, in reality, we have, as I mentioned earlier, 2% contraction last year, 2.3 or so expected for this year, at least according to the central bank. We have higher unemployment, and we have a general slowdown in spending and investment and so on. All of that is actually going to temper because of that decrease in consumption, decrease in demand, and decreased fiscal spending. That will temper some of the price increase that could be caused by the fuel subsidy reduction. And in any event, that reduction in the fuel subsidy will trigger basically a one-off increase in prices, and it will work its way through and taper off over time. So we will see an inflationary impact. The question of how severe it will be, like I said, it could be anywhere between where it is now and 20% inflation. But I think it will come in well below that empirical model based on the countervailing factors that we have at play.
Marla, what have been the major changes in your projections since you did your Trinidad and Tobago economic outlook back in January?
Wow, lots. Well, a lot has changed since January. We know that production is falling in the energy sector, as I mentioned, which we didn't really anticipate that much decline in production. So, my guess is that the contraction will be steeper, which was validated by the central bank and the minister. My guess also is that given that the minister has said the adjustment period is going to now last longer, he had said he's going to balance the budget by 2018. He's now saying 2019-2020 fiscal year. So with that lengthening of the adjustment process, I'm guessing that that means you're going to have not as steep an upfront an adjustment now as we had expected, and the recovery period is going to be much longer, maybe 2 years longer than I had originally expected it to be. But I do expect that the contraction this year is going to be steeper than I had originally in January, and I think that I would hazard a guess that maybe we will be seeing another contraction next year, even though I had originally said maybe zero growth next year. Given what has changed, I'm thinking maybe there will be a further contraction next year.
So the economy returns to growth in 2018. Is that what you're seeing?
Well, as of now, maybe zero growth or maybe very low growth. Incidentally, I know the IMF had projected, let me read for you here, they are expecting growth to return in 2017 at 1.78% and going to 2.7 in 2018. That's what the IMF is projecting. I don't see that happening.
Let's talk about debt to GDP for just a minute. If debt's expanding and GDP is contracting, what does that ratio look like going forward?
Well, right now, gross public sector debt to GDP is about 68%. And if you have the numerator expanding and the denominator contracting, well, you're going to get a higher debt to GDP ratio. And the minister did speak about borrowing. You have a deficit of about, after these capital transactions, you have a deficit of about 6.7 billion that has to be financed. Some of it will be new borrowing, but also, incidentally, there was a discussion before the media review, and also it was mentioned in the media review that there is about, according to the central bank statistics, over 30 billion in sterilized debt that the government is saying and has said in the press and so on in the past few months that they can access some of this sterilized debt. So this is debt that was already issued via OMOs and so on by the central bank, and these funds, these proceeds were sterilized, and we're assuming that those funds are still available and that the government can tap into it. And so if you have this over $30 billion in sterilized debt that the government can probably tap, and it's already counted in the gross public sector debt to GDP ratio, it means that there's a possibility that they won't have to raise as much debt as the size of the deficit would suggest.
Okay, and coming out of the Article 4 consultation, and the ratings firms were just down in Trinidad. The minister himself made mention to that. What are your expectations for ratings in 2016?
Well, we have been put on negative outlook by S&P, happened around Christmas time last year. Moody's last month put the rating on review for downgrade, along with some other petro states. I would say we've had some improvement in terms of political stability. We've had an election last year, and that would have added some. It would have been, I guess, a ratings constraint on the political side. But on the downside, we've had some external deterioration and we've had some fiscal deterioration since these ratings were last reviewed. And so my guess is that it's possible we can see both Moody's and Standard & Poor's downgrade us. Moody's in particular, they have our rating at 2 notches above speculative grade, and based on their outlook for oil and gas prices, I think there is a possibility they would downgrade us. And in addition to S&P has a lot more room above speculative grade, but their negative outlook and the deterioration, as I mentioned, on the fiscal and external fronts might justify that they bring their rating down a little bit.
Okay, now it's time to turn it over to our audience for their questions and answers, and I've actually received quite a few. The first question here is, aside from the fiscal adjustments that have to be made and economic diversification, which are the two obvious ones, what else would you suggest needs to be addressed to fix the TNT economy?
To fix the TNT economy. Well, I think a big part of what needs to be fixed, aside from the ones that were mentioned, diversification and the fiscal adjustment, I think governance is a big issue. And governance has a direct impact on confidence. And confidence affects investment. And we know that investment is a major driver of growth and is a major driver of overall progress in our economy. And I think that if we can fix governance, at least improve governance, I mean, we haven't seen any improvements on the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, and that's worrying to me. For example, if you look at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, which we slipped 3 points on, some of the biggest problematic factors I will call out here for you have to do with governance, enforcing contracts, getting electricity, registering property, and so on, starting a business. And even on the competitiveness index, there were mention of a lot of issues that were some of the most problematic for us that we ranked very low on, and they were all governance issues related to trust in public institutions and trust in politicians and so on. So I think governance is something we really need to address. Another thing we need to address is I think we need to address the pro-cyclicality of fiscal policy in Trinidad, because the oil and gas sector really does cause quite a bit of volatility in our growth rate, right? Now, that's because of the structure of our economy. But the pro-cyclicality of fiscal policy just exacerbates that. So when we earn more, we spend more, and so we get faster growth rates than we probably should have. And then when there is a slump, as we are in now, they contract fiscal spending, and that just causes probably a steeper economic contraction. So we need to have fiscal policy that's counter-cyclical as opposed to pro-cyclical. And one of the ways to get fiscal policy to force it to be counter-cyclical is to impose fiscal rules. But that's another discussion for another day, I think.
Okay. And, another question that we have, how will the contraction of Trinidad's economy, how is that going to impact the rest of the region?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, in terms of a CARICOM arrangement, Trinidad does import from some of the other Caribbean nations, but we also export. One would hope that with the depreciation in the currency, it could possibly make some of our exports, non-oil exports, that is, a little more competitive. But insofar as we have a domestic contraction in consumption and a domestic contraction in demand, It could mean that our demand for goods from our neighboring Caribbean nations, our imports from them might decline. I can quite see that happen, especially with the constraints we have around foreign exchange as well. That's a possibility.
Okay, we've got another one here. Given the imminent economic downturn, what incentives can government provide to maintain or increase employment levels?
Employment levels.
That's right.
Yes. Well, the thing about incentives is that, do you really want to implement incentives in an economic downturn that are designed to be temporary in a situation where we have unemployment spiking, and then it becomes a permanent feature in the government's list of incentives? And that's what sometimes happens. So I don't generally like this whole idea of incentives. I think what the government needs to do is to use the mechanism of the social safety network and make sure that we have a proper functioning social safety network that targets the people and reaches the people that it needs to reach, so that those who become unemployed in an economic downturn are properly taken care of by the social safety network, as opposed to incentivizing uh, uh, employment levels that are probably not feasible and not realistic.
Okay, I know that you said that it was a discussion for another day, but I've just gotten two questions about fiscal rules. So I'm going to go ahead.
Two questions.
I'm going to go ahead and, yeah. One of them asked if that means that TNT should go into an IMF program, and the other one says if you could just give a better explanation of what that could look like in Trinidad.
Well, you would only, so the first part about, the IMF, you would only really need to go to the IMF um, if you have a debt crisis and or a foreign exchange crisis. We have neither. We have debt to GDP of 68 or so percent. That is gross public sector debt to GDP, and we have, as I mentioned earlier, 11 months of import coverage. So we're not facing either a debt or a foreign exchange crisis. So we don't have to go to the IMF. And I mean, there's so much talk, even the politicians and so on have been talking about, well, we don't want to go to the IMF. I think that's nowhere near on the cards. But yes, you're right in assuming that it will happen under an IMF program, because that's generally when it happens in this region. Countries do not generally impose fiscal rules upon themselves unless it's under an IMF program and the IMF stipulates it, like what happened in Jamaica. But I have been hearing rumblings about other countries like the Bahamas and Barbados, for example, discussing the possibility of putting in fiscal rules. I think it's important to recognize that this counter-cyclical fiscal policy is going to be better for us in the longer term. And I think it's important to realize that fiscal prudence and fiscal responsibility is needed, and it's needed throughout the region. That's the whole reason why we ended up in a situation in most of this region where we're over indebted, because we don't have fiscal responsibility rules. What that might look like, for example, I would suggest your increase in debt to GDP should not be faster than your growth rate. And that way you can make sure that your debt to GDP ratio does not increase. I would suggest, for example, that you have strict rules on how state-owned enterprises can incur debt. And because we have seen over time for many countries in this region, including Trinidad and Tobago, that state-owned enterprises, their obligations and their liabilities can end up impacting the central government's fiscal budget. So we need to have some kinds of rules around those, and I don't think we have enough. But I mean, we can talk about. I do have a paper that maybe Melissa, you can probably share with your audience around what some of these fiscal rules might look like. But basically, fiscal rules set limits on how big your deficit can be over time. There are escape clauses when you have a crisis, for example. So it's not just ironclad. And you can set limits around what percentage of GDP or what percentage of revenue your expenditure can be, and so on. But just to make sure that there are controls. But going back to my point about governance, you can have fiscal rules, but in terms of enforcement, you have to have strong institutions surrounding that, and you have to have good governance, or else these rules will amount to nothing.
Okay. Could you speak to the issue of bank de-risking in Trinidad and Tobago, in the banks ending correspondent banking relationships for the Caribbean?
Well, we've not really seen too much of that happen in Trinidad. I know it's been a big issue in many other countries in this region. Belize, of course, one of the biggest in terms of how big the impact has been. I think this is a problem that has to do with size in terms of the smallness of our economies and the revenue that these banks earn relative to the risk that they take. It also has to do with international regulations and how tight international regulations have been getting. And it also has to do with the fact that the Caribbean has been a hotspot. You saw with Panama Papers most recently, for example. The Caribbean has been a target over many, many years for money laundering and illicit movement of funds and so on. And so many banks are seeing this as a possible reputational risk, as well as other financial risks and so on. So I think that this is something that has to be advocated at a regional level and has to be discussed and negotiated with the large regulators and governments at a regional level. So the US and the EU, for example, the OECD. I think on a regional scale, we need to have that discussion and not individual countries negotiating on their own behalf.
Okay, diversification is another question that we've had a few on. One of them says diversification's been touted for many years. Seriously speaking, which areas do you think the government should focus on to see tangible results in the next 3 to 5 years?
3 to 5 years. Well, that's a short term. I mean, the minister did speak about tourism. He spoke about agriculture, manufacturing as possible diversification areas. I agree with tourism. The problem with tourism is that you have to get your security um, in order. People will not come or ought not to subject themselves to the risk of coming if you really can't get your security situation in order. But I do think that tourism, but with a different twist, not just the traditional sun, sea, and sand, because that's not what we have in Trinidad. We might have it in Tobago, but in Trinidad, I mean, as I've said before, I think we need to sell ourselves from a tourism perspective as the party capital of this hemisphere. And I think I don't think anybody's better at throwing parties than Trinidadians. I think we need to capitalize that. We need to box it, brand it, and sell it to the world. And not just sell Trinidad as a party capital, but sell Trinidadians as party makers. So we can go to your destination and help you make your parties for your people better as well, and give them technical assistance on how parties can be organized, or as we call them, fets. But I do think that in the next 3 to 5 years, tourism is probably one of the easier to accomplish if we can get the security situation right. Manufacturing is another. I think we do already have quite a bit of a manufacturing base here. I think we need to become more efficient. I think we need to diversify also the product offering, and I think we can do it in Trinidad.
Along the same lines of manufacturing, we got a question in here. I think that's a really good question stemming from your point on good governance. What are your thoughts on the government's plans to guarantee loans through the Exim Bank? You and I have discussed that before. Could you just give some light around that?
Well, I don't know that the government is guaranteeing the loans through Exim Bank. From my understanding, my very cursory understanding of how this works, is that the government is going to target exporters, and they're going to give them US dollar loans so that they can purchase the import components that they need for to manufacture their export product. So they're going to lend them US dollars through the Exim Bank that they can then repay in TT dollars. That's my understanding of it. I don't understand. My understanding is not that there is a guarantee by the government on the loan. My understanding is that they can borrow US dollars through the Exim Bank once you're an exporter, and you can repay in TT dollars. Now, my confusion with that, and maybe, I mean, forgive me, but it could be that I'm missing something because I don't know enough about this. But if you're an exporter and you're earning US dollars, I'm not sure I understand why the facility can be repaid in TT dollars. So that's my first point of confusion. But and these exporters, I guess, should be able to access US dollars just through the banking sector, as opposed to what is tantamount to buying it from the Exim Bank, except that you're not just buying it, but you're also paying an interest rate on a loan for buying it in US and sorry, for borrowing in US and repaying in TT. So that's another point of confusion for me, and it could just be that I don't have enough information. But I think what I would say about this facility that I think makes sense, it seems to me that the government is trying to target exporters and support exporters and control who gets foreign exchange and who's prioritized, I should say, by using this mechanism of going through the Exim Bank. That's my understanding.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and then after that question, we're going to announce the bonus that Marla has available for everyone today. But that last question, I have a question here about renewable energy and that countries in the region are looking towards more renewable sources of energy. What does the government have in place to reduce the reliance on oil and gas? And I think that this is a really good question for you, because I know that you sat on the panel at the Energy Chambers at the Energy Chambers conference in January, and that the Ministry of Energy also announced their renewable energy program at that conference. So if there's anything you could say around that.
Yeah. Well, I just want to give you two statistics that I quoted at that conference, Melissa. Trinidad and Tobago has the second lowest proportion of total electricity production generated by renewables, and that was in 2012, second only to Turkmenistan. So that's just one statistic I'll give you there on renewables. We are not serious about renewables in this country, I don't think. The minister mentioned in this mid-year review, and it had been mentioned in previous budgets, that they want to give incentives to motor vehicle buyers to buy, how do you call those, hybrids, electric and CNG vehicles, by reducing or eliminating most of the taxes applicable to those vehicles, which is fine, and I'm happy about that. But on the CNG side, we don't have enough CNG fueling stations, and the government had said previously that they're going to put in more. That hasn't happened. But what the government hasn't said is that I think every vehicle that the government purchases should be a hybrid or CNG or electric vehicle. And that, to me, one, sets the example, and that's how you lead. You lead by example, and they're our leadership. But also, it will help the industry get going. It will make the dealerships will have to import the vehicles to supply the government, and then also the fuel stations will have to install the CNG ready pumps if you have a greater stock of cars to fuel. And if the government takes a stance and says, well, it'll start with us, we're going to kick this off, and we're going to assure that every vehicle we purchase for the government is going to be either CNG, electric or hybrid, I think that'll help to get things going. But other than that initiative, there really hasn't been a lot going with respect to renewables in Trinidad. Not enough, not nearly as much as we see in the rest of the region, particularly in the smaller islands that are net importers of fuel.
Okay, great. Look, Marla, we are coming to the end of our time today, but before our audience disconnects, I do want to tell them about the bonus that we have for them today, because Marla has very generously made her report on the mid-year budget review available, and we will be sending out the download link to that when we send out the replay link for this webinar on YouTube. So I would like to thank you all very much for joining us today. We hope to see you in future events. And thank you, Marla, for your insights and for being back with us here today. This was a wonderful event, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa.